I laid it right on top of you, and now you're carrying me around. That's cool.
I don't know if you can see it, but the writing from Euclid is still in the sky. It's
Where is that?
If you look up in the
Oh,
sky,
that stuff.
you can see
Oh,
it.
nice. That's cool.
There's
It's
white
cool that
writing.
it's projected over a sphere.
Yeah. All right. We should get started. I guess we've got quite a bit to talk about. Your proposed topic for today was to talk about transhumanism and a bit about robots. Where do you want to start? You had some comments you wanted to make following up on our previous discussion, I think.
Yeah. So I just felt that I didn't do a very good job last time. Making some of the key points that and which of course came to my mind afterwards. I wasn't at my best last time. I'm still not at my best now. Whole family's been sick for 8 weeks now, so it's off and on, and this has been exhausting and miserable. So I honestly don't know if I'm going to do a whole lot better today, but at least I organized my thoughts afterwards. Um, uh, and I've been eavesdropping on some of the transhumanist, the organized H plus uh, sort of bulletin board. There's an old-fashioned bulletin board and sort of a listserv set of messaging, you know, services that the H plus community, which is sort of the most organized transhumanist community in the U.S. anyway. I guess it's international. And I kind of just lurk. I don't really ever participate, but honestly, I hadn't looked at it for a long time. But when this was in my mind, I kind of went and pulled up some of these messages and had a look through, and it was interesting to see what was being discussed right now. And there's a lot of, not heated debate or anything, but there's interest in the community talking about the associations between some of the very wealthy and very prominent Silicon Valley, tech giants, the tech billionaires, and there are a few sort of scandalous individuals. The Sam Bankman-Fried, the cryptocurrency fraudster, comes to mind, but there are others, and there's sort of an entanglement between Silicon Valley culture in general and some of the leading figures in that community, and effective altruism, and the EAC, the effective accelerationism movement, and transhumanism, which is far older. Transhumanism is more than a century old, and it's we're now in this kind of the transhumanist community is in this interesting situation where they're being painted with a broad brush and lumped in and stereotyped together with some of these other groups. And transhumanism's already got it's got plenty of its own stigmas and issues to deal with, right? So it doesn't need to become synonymous with
Yeah.
cryptocurrency fraudsters and that kind of stuff. So anyway, it was interesting to see, though, to be a fly on the wall for those discussions among some of the very prominent figures in that community. I seldom, if ever, participate, but it did get me thinking in more organized terms about just sort of what is it about the idea of transcending the limitations of human inherited biology, the Homo sapiens biology that we're all familiar with. What is it about that that's appealing? Like, why is there anything about that that's interesting or potentially valuable or useful at some level of analysis? And so I spent a little time over the holidays just kind of mulling that over. And so that was what I felt I haven't really explained well enough, I think, or articulated well enough in our previous discussions. And so I thought I could at least articulate that a little more clearly today. That was the only thing. It was really just sort of a closeout of that, some of the earlier discussions that we've had on this topic. We could talk more about other things related to transhumanism, but it may be getting a little bit tedious at this point. But that was what I had in mind. And then I thought we could spend, if you'll indulge me, a bigger chunk today. I'd like to ask you guys, the experts in machine learning, these new incredible AI models and the technology that's driving them, and just get a little bit more insight from where the state of the art is and what the trajectory looks like for integrating the latest and greatest AI technology into robotics. Now because that is starting to feel more plausible, more practical, just closer in general than, and less like science fiction, frankly, than it did even 6 months or a year ago. There've been some significant advances, I think, as startups and established players are starting to see, well, there's, if the promise of robotics can finally be made real, because the limitation was always on the software side, it was never really on the hardware side, or hasn't been for decades and decades, then it would be prudent to kind of get a handle on where we are with that as well, because I think that there are some quite profound implications to robotics.
I want to come back to
and
that.
Quite frankly, that's a little closer to. Sorry, go ahead.
Let's come back to that assertion about the relative difficulty of hardware versus software, because I think that might be a bit of a controversial point. But yeah, continue.
Okay, yeah, well, that would be a good thing to talk about too. I mean, I'm bringing in a set of assumptions that we could easily, critique on the hardware side, and that would be great too. Maybe we could start there and then move into the discussion about AI from there. So, does that sound like fair stuff to talk about today? So, with transhumanism. And I offline, Dan, I don't know if you saw, but I sort of issued a challenge to you. Not a serious challenge, but I put to you a challenge, which was to well, anyway, we'll get to there. But let me state the premise first, and then I'll convey what this challenge was. And if you've had some time to think about that, it may be fun to see what you've come up with. Okay, so the premise was that. I think the reason for me personally, and as I observe other folks in the transhumanist community, I think it's the same. I think that at bottom, transhumanism offers the promise to alleviate suffering. I think fundamentally that is its appeal to me and to many others. And that begs the question, can it alleviate suffering? Which begs the further question, is suffering in some part or large part or entirely a function or a product of our inherited and so far almost entirely immutable biology? And my argument is that yes, the overwhelming majority, depending on how you parse the ideas of what's physical and what's mental and intellectual and emotional and so forth, but you can be reductive about it and reduce all of that to biology, I think fairly straightforwardly. Then I think you're on pretty firm ground saying we're ultimately, we're biological creatures, we're products of evolution. Evolution is merciless and utterly ruthless, and all of human suffering is ultimately either a direct function of or product of our biology, or a secondary but nevertheless unavoidable consequence or side effect of our biology. And proceeding from that premise, if we could transcend, in other words, modify or escape from entirely our biology, that's basically the idea. Is if we could transcend, if we could escape from the current constraints and limitations of our biology, that it then follows that we might be able to overcome suffering in many, perhaps most, of its present forms that we're all so familiar with. And so that is I think both the sort of the foundational set of assumptions and premise, and then the promise of transhumanism that is so important and so provocative and so powerful for me personally. And then I don't feel that I'm speaking out of turn by claiming that to speak for many others in the transhumanist community, or just many others in general who longstanding science fiction fans and whatever, who see problems, sources of suffering of various kinds, and see technology, and specifically the technology to escape existing human limitations, as offering solutions or alleviations of the suffering that just plagues human existence and all of the existence of all living things to some extent. So yeah, that's the basic premise. And then the challenge that I then issued to Dan was was, you give me an example of suffering that you think is not reducible in that sense, and I'll see if I can reduce it. In other words, I'll run a thought experiment and see if I can say, okay, let's see if I can solve that suffering with transhumanism. That was my challenge.
Good. Okay. Well, here's one. So to go back to the culture novels. So in Accession, it doesn't really matter, but it's just a concrete example. So in Accession, I don't know if you remember, but there's a sort of small character who is angling to get into Contact, this exciting division where stuff actually happens in the culture, and is quite anxious about getting in. And it's a young female character, and is waiting for somebody to get in touch with her, and quite angry when something goes wrong with that process or whatever. Now, you could say she was suffering while she was waiting for that increase in her status that she very desperately wanted. I think that is not the kind of suffering that you want to put on the table, right? You're talking about more fundamental suffering, but obviously we're equipped to perceive suffering and find suffering in all sorts of trivial nonsense in some relative sense, in some absolute sense. That would seem like trivial nonsense to our ancestors, but nonetheless seems like very real suffering today. The suffering while Russell waits for the next Minecraft update might seem trivial, but is sort of real by his standards. How do you distinguish I mean, that's a bit silly, but how do you fundamentally distinguish this kind of status anxiety or desire fulfillment, lack of desire fulfillment suffering from starving to death? Obviously these are very different, but where is the line in between them, and are you planning to alleviate all of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one caveat that I did put in my note to you offline about this was that in fully admitting that in order to maximize well-being or flourishing or prosperity or some any other vague kind of floating signifier of good life and happiness, we have to fully admit that there is a role for sacrifice and patience and anything that is sort of bittersweet that contextualizes the rewards. We do need to admit that there has to be some less than black and white, or more than black and white, more subtle, more complex than simply black and white notion of where satisfaction, value, utility come from, and that there's room in a larger, more expansive notion of those ideas to admit temporary or short-term pain, discomfort, suffering, sacrifice, loss, cost, in many different dimensions of those sorts of things, to give context to rewards that either subsequently occur or occur alongside those pains. And so that I'm not I'm not necessarily arguing for converting everybody into just a hedonic computronium sort of state where you're just maximizing pleasure continuously and minimizing pain and suffering and loss and hardship and sacrifice entirely. I don't know what to make of that depiction. It's that I think is probably a genuine philosophical challenge. Like, why not just convert every conscious system into hedonium? But I think the general thinking is that
there's an easy answer to that, which is totalitarianism is bad no matter what the content.
Yeah, but you can push back philosophically and say if your brain was structured such that it could only experience pleasure, you wouldn't experience any dissatisfaction or pleasure or from being oppressed or from lacking prospects for growth and change or development. I mean, I don't know how to fully respond to the hedonium critique. I've seen it. I've seen some significant philosophical discussion, by real philosophers. I think Nick Bostrom is an example of somebody who's discussed hedonium quite a bit at length, and probably his material that I've read that's lurking in the back of my mind I probably don't cite him well enough, or others in those discussions. But this is definitely an area where that's been explored. And as I say, I don't know how to push back against that. So I wouldn't take this quite that far, but I would definitely accept short of that. So let's just push the hedonium response off the table for now, because that's sort of a trump card you can lay on everything. And I want to accept at face value what you asked earlier, which is that let's distinguish categories of suffering, dissatisfaction, and a variety of other states that human minds can experience now. And so we have sort of a set of sources of displeasure or suffering that are rooted primarily in physicality. So we might think of these are mostly to do with your body and the general experiences that you have via your body. And then if we, again, just for sake of argument, I'm not trying to invoke some formal dualism or anything like that. Let's just keep the rest of your body a bit separate categorically from your brain and what's going on. Obviously your brain's part of your body, but what's going on mostly in your brain, which is emotional and psychological and sociological experiences. And that's all the sort of the more ineffable, less tangible forms of suffering, things that come from emotional states like anxiety, like fear, like depression, like boredom or impatience, and waiting for the next update to Minecraft and a zillion other things, anxiety or concerns about where you are in the status hierarchy and that sort of stuff. And so I want to accept that categorization. I think that's fair. I think that just for qualitative and practical, pragmatic purposes, it's fair to distinguish those categories. We have forever, right? I mean, for centuries, we've distinguished those categories. So then the question would be, okay, how do you, so accepting that as a premise, then the answer to your question is, how would transhumanism address both of those things separately? And I think that we already see some pretty good early examples of how both of those different broad categories, just sort of the grossly physical and then the more subtly mental categories. So let's just be crude about it and divide them into those two classes. I think that there is technology on the horizon. You don't need to go to uploading and hedonium and those sorts of extremes. I think there's technology on the horizon that builds upon cultural and just basic psychological mechanisms we already employ that could alleviate a huge amount of suffering in those respects. So we're talking about pushing the frontiers of medicine just a little bit further, pushing the frontiers of education just a little bit further, pushing the frontiers of just general psychological good practice and enculturated mindset and self-control and self-discipline. You can get a lot of mileage out of that even today, and we don't have to push those horizons very far forward to think, wow, a lot of the way that people suffer today could be alleviated quite significantly. But so I can talk through some examples of that, but that would be my argument.
Yeah, I would agree, but that seems to me to be like 80% an argument that is true independent of transhumanism, unless maybe we should clearly define whether or not for you transhumanism necessarily involves like physical changes to the human body, or if we just radically change the environment and it's the same meat bags, but they are somehow in an environment which is so radically different from the ancestral one that for all intents and purposes, they're kind of different. We're ingesting huge amounts of data through little flickering dots on pieces of glass, which are not in the ancestral environment. That nonetheless doesn't strike me as being transhuman, although, maybe you could argue that. But whereas, if you're saying transhumanism could reduce suffering and maybe should be endorsed on those grounds, what part of it is separate from just let's have lots of technological progress and fix lots of stuff that way?
Yeah, that's a perfectly valid question, and my answer is yes. I'm specifically talking about altering our physiology, both in both of those broad categories I mentioned. So basically, all of your body and its various systems that aren't inside your skull and your brain and aren't part of your brain, and then altering the physiology of your brain. such that you have you address another set of sources of suffering. So I am talking about intervening on the biology physiologically at the level of individuals to achieve these things. I'm not explicitly just talking about environmental modifications, which is largely what we've, not entirely, but a big part of what we've done so far. Certainly the general strategic approach of humanity as a species has been to, well, you take what you got biologically and you modify the environment as best you can around those parameters. And to a first approximation, that's pretty much what what human civilization's done. Now, what I'm talking about is inverting that, not entirely, but certainly, flipping the script a bit from what it's been historically, and saying, okay, well, no, let's talk about even okay, even if you were just talking about trying to bring a randomly selected individual, so you say you sample the population and you pull out an individual. What I'm talking about would be as a first step. I'm not talking about post-humanism. As a first step, one could simply imagine bringing a randomly selected individual. Let's say they volunteered to do this. So we're not being tyrannical about this, but let's say somebody volunteered, like I would put my hand up, to bring my own physiology into alignment with an idealized human physiology as I conceive of it, right? And so this gets a little bit to this example I mentioned offline in my email to you. So if I could, take a pill or get an injection or something relatively easy and not in itself onerous and miserable and excruciating and taking years to undergo, if it was a fairly quick and tolerable procedure, would I volunteer to become Captain America physiologically? Of course I would. Of course I would. Now, the idea behind Captain America, it's a little distorted in the recent films, but the idea for the original character is he's not superhuman. He is on basically all dimensions, all parameters, optimally human. So the character Captain America can do what the most capable human being can do in any given domain. He's as strong as the strongest person. He's as fast as the fastest person. He's as smart as the smartest person. He's got the fastest, his reflexes are as good as the best reflex. He can fight as well as the best trained fighter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is his quote unquote superpower. So he is superhuman in this sense that you've brought all of that capability into one individual. But he's not fundamentally exceeding human limits on any specific dimension. So what we're talking about there is some sort of platonic ideal form physiologically of what a human being is. And you could just say, well, what about technology that brings any individual, should they choose, into closer or very close alignment with whatever that ideal is, even it's setting superhuman capabilities off to the sides, disallowing them for the moment. That would still be very much, in my mind, transhumanism. So now let's back off of that comic book extreme and say, well, what are technologies already on the horizon that do a little bit of this? Well, there are things like technology that keeps you youthful instead of letting you age past that ideal form. It's technology that, take a pill or an injection like semaglutide or tirzepatide or one of these other, basically a diet in technology that allows you to not gain weight and to not be more obese than or more fat than you would like to be, to maintain something closer to what is called in the various literatures ideal body weight. What if you could take an exercise pill? So something that made you fit without having to put in grueling hours in the gym every day to achieve that. What if you could have the youth and the physicality and the capability of an Olympic athlete without an Olympic athlete, all the sacrifices that have to be made. And then, of course, there are many people who just don't have that, no matter how hard they work, they're not going to achieve what the greatest Olympians do, obviously. So that is the kind of transhumanism purely on the physical side that I'm talking about. Now, and leave aside the mental aspects of it. Consider how much suffering there is in the world that narrowly, strictly speaking, would be alleviated by just those technologies. So a huge portion of the suffering in the world, absolutely enormous portion, is simply a product of people not feeling the way they want to feel because they're in pain or uncomfortable or incapable in some fundamental way, chronically. There's a huge amount of suffering, and again, things build, they cascade from that starting point. So if you're uncomfortable all the time, you can't do the other things that would give you joy and satisfaction. So if you have a bad knee, for example, well, there goes hiking and a whole bunch of other activities. There goes all sorts of other productive work or employment that you might need or want to do. Things can really snowball from a relatively small physiological limitation to begin with. Now think of all the suffering that's associated with aging. I mean, growing old and dying of old age was probably the greatest source of misery and suffering that our species experiences. I think it's probably pretty hard to argue that it isn't. I mean, everybody gets old, they get less capable, they become more uncomfortable, they lose their faculties. Both being in that situation of debilitation and the loss from former ability is both of those things together are pretty miserable. It's easy for young people to not appreciate that all that much, but as you get older, you do, it becomes exquisitely clear what you've lost when you've lost your soundness of body and your vitality of youth. These are terrible losses, just outright in themselves. And then how much suffering and misery just flows from those things. And then it's just trivial stuff. How much misery is there because people are just sick? How much misery and suffering is there because of the sort of imperfect measures that we take now? Drugs, for example, are the obvious one. People are basically trying to medicate some sort of suffering away from their lives, and they turn to substance abuse to do that. Gigantic numbers, hundreds of millions of people abuse pharmaceutical substances today, every day, chronic abuse of these things, because they ultimately they just feel rotten. They're in pain or there's some physiological problem. And that's just purely on the physiological side. And then there are, of course, connections to the psychological, again, like the snowballing effects, the follow-on effects from having purely physical, bodily problems that are social and psychological that flow on directly from that. So here's another example. Consider how many problems in a person's life. Again, take a random person or a random sample of the global population. If you say you sampled 100,000 people, and randomly across the planet, and some of them are having great lives, some of them are pretty miserable. A lot of them, all of them are virtually all are experiencing some sources of suffering or dissatisfaction or outright pain and misery. And some are all of the time. Okay, take all those 100,000 people, and overnight they get a treatment, and they wake up in the morning, and they are literally in the body of Captain America or the female. I don't know the female equivalent, strictly speaking, of Captain America, but Wonder Woman, not Superman, like you can fly and your bullets bounce off you, Wonder Woman, but just okay. You wake up in this ideal physical form. You're perfectly healthy. You look and feel and can do what an Olympic athlete in absolute peak human performance can do. That's what you wake up like that, and with the physical beauty, like the face of Wonder Woman or one of the Marvel superheroes. That's the body you wake up in tomorrow. Now, how many problems does that solve for you? How much suffering does that alleviate? No, so sure, it was not going to like Chris Hemsworth or whoever the actors are. I'm saying you wake up in looking like the best version of your idealized self that you could dream of. What if you woke up like that tomorrow? And for huge numbers of people, this would be a staggering reset on all of their suffering. So that's not uploading into virtual reality. That's not converting, totally transforming human minds into things that cannot experience pain or suffering or these things that these other emotional states that are unpleasant.
But that all seems just talking kind of uncontroversial to me. So yeah, I agree. But I don't think there's much disagreement between us on that point. I suppose it depends. I mean, maybe if I was to be a Grinch and find a storm cloud inside that silver lining, it would be to say that there's a slippery slope there, I suppose you could worry about, where if you cross that threshold and you've made the world unambiguously much better for almost everyone, which seems purely good, it might nonetheless be, in some sense, bad because you have opened the doorway to basically destabilizing the entire species in some sense. And so I don't actually believe this argument, but let me persist anyway. So I suppose that is often an argument conservatives will make against things that seem like on the margin to be good changes, simply because the downstream consequences of especially profound change, like simultaneously doing that to everybody, is to then make it highly likely, you might argue, that the conception of the human race as a single thing that has some coherence will very quickly thereafter shatter, and that it might be a bad thing for that to happen. And perhaps the cost of avoiding that shattering is to not make these incredibly good changes. Now, I don't actually buy the following argument, but I think some people would say let's take feminism as an example. So some very conservative people would look at the problem with demographics in, say, China or the West or many countries and say that increasing women's rights and allowing them to choose whether they reproduce and so on has led to the collapse of those societies. I don't agree with that. And even if it were true, maybe still it's the right thing to do. But there's something to that argument, maybe not that precise argument, but the world is not constructed in such a way that every locally justified improvement necessarily globally does not have catastrophic consequences, at least by the metrics that you might currently measure consequences. Now, by some other metric, say by human flourishing or liberalism, maybe demographic collapse is a price worth paying for individual freedom. And so actually it's an improvement even accepting that consequence. But those are different sets of values according to which one outcome, which is catastrophic by one, is to be desired by the other. And I can imagine something at a much larger scale, a similar argument being levied against transhumanism, where I don't think the point you're making can be really disagreed with, right? Like locally, there's suffering, alleviating it seems perfectly good. But these changes really cannot be considered in isolation of the consequences of walking down that path viewed in totality. And in totality, maybe they have truly catastrophic consequences for the kind of coherence of our species and so on that are inextricably linked to pursuing these locally good changes. So I don't know how you think about the relation between the ethical justification for alleviating suffering and how it might be separated from the consequences of pursuing the means and broad dissemination of those means for alleviating that suffering.
Yeah, I'm actually quite sympathetic to that line of critique, and it is in some sense analogous to the tragedy of the commons dynamic that we see, in other systems. Famously because of the literal example of the tragedy of the commons, ecological examples. But I could see something similar happening where what logically makes sense for individuals, so some sort of utility optimization, some sort of course of action that leads to good outcomes, or some rational behavior from individuals, could ultimately, at a different level of analysis, lead to a worse outcome for everyone as the clock ticks forward and the consequences unfold of those individual choices. So I'm actually quite sympathetic to that, and I'll give you a specific reason why, and that's that in the example in the scenario that I described, this sort of toy example where everyone gets a transhumanist upgrade to the idealized human form. This is obviously not realistic. I mean, it's not remotely plausible. It's not remotely realistic. And the main reason why it's not that it's impossible technologically. It's that the idealized human form is not the limit in any meaningful sense of what the technology will allow, what it will permit, right? So any technology that you can conceive of that could turn a human being, relatively tolerably transform a human being into some idealized form, like, you take the Captain America treatment, for example. Any technology that's capable of achieving that will quite obviously be capable of achieving much more radical transformations than just that. And so there's no plausible scenario in my mind in which the technologies that are capable of going a little bit of the way to alleviate suffering are not also going to be able to go vastly farther than that. And in so doing, push us well into post-human territory, where people are transforming themselves in totally radical ways. And because I think that is unavoidable, that's once that horse is out of the barn, that's, it's just, you're tearing off on this trajectory upwards of technological capability, and there's no way you're only throwing open one or two doors with that capability. Okay, so then loop back around and return to the critique you were playing devil's advocate. You were steel manning this critique, but let's return to that. Well, what about a world where technology and individual sort of liberal freedoms allow people to radically expand their capabilities, to go straight from the human condition today, not slowly and then park it to Captain America for many generations, but just go straight from today to full on post-human in all of its crazy radical imagined possibilities. That I think is that is a situation where you could quite rightly argue this change could be just unmanageable. It could be so radical, so extreme, and one could also imagine any difference in starting point or the pacing of the rollout of this availability of this technology could then be amplified into gigantic discrepancies or disparities between individuals. And one of the things that creates a totally unrealistically rosy picture, again, it's not a plausible future, but the one I described, where everybody is basically equalized by a technology. Okay, everybody's turned into Captain America, but maybe that's boring because then everybody looks like Captain America or something very close to it. There's less diversity, there's less disparity between people. Maybe that's a good thing, but in some ways it's a little, maybe that kind of uniformity is a little depressing in some sense. But at least it's fair. At least there's some equality there. At least there's some equitability there. But if you're talking about, some people decide to just, crank their IQ by a factor of 100 and others don't, and some people decide to become 50 feet tall, and some people decide to become made out of metal and upload, and some people, if you're talking about in totally crazy range of possibilities, well, they're going to be, the disparities that could create will utterly dwarf the disparities that humanity is already today struggling to deal with. I mean, the disparities that exist between human beings today are trivial compared to the ones that technology of the future could admit of. And I think that from that perspective, this idea that this technology could be dangerously destabilizing socially, but I think there's a lot too. I think that is a valid critique and something that we do need to be concerned about. I don't have a solution to that. I've never seen anybody propose anything remotely convincing as a solution to that challenge. But I do think that is perhaps the greatest challenge that we face is, some people are going to become gods. And if it's not everybody all at once, it's not everybody equally, and it's not everybody up to the same degree, then we're talking about just amplifying disparities in a way that are difficult to one gropes for comparisons because it's the differences we have between people today are so minuscule compared to the differences that could exist between sentient beings, and I'm really worried about that. Yeah, and then this gets back to then you're in a situation where posthumans. What's the difference in principle between a posthuman and an artificial superintelligence? I mean, if their horizon of capability is broadly comparable, they could make broadly comparable choices and act in broadly comparable ways, and then all of the concerns you might have about artificial superintelligence would apply to posthumans as well. And then multiply that by how many billions of people might want to journey down that path, and you're in truly difficult territory, right?
I have to say that I do increasingly think of this discussion about transhumanism and posthumanism as more or less being not exactly the same, but pretty parallel to the way I think about the alignment problem for superintelligence. And maybe that's an interesting thing to discuss a bit, to draw out the way in which they're the same or different. But let's make sure we didn't leave too many loose threads hanging on the previous discussion. So to summarize, you talked through the ways in which physical suffering is a very predominant experience for most people, and how not only kind of evolutions of the current technologies for alleviating that, whether medical treatments, drugs, surgery, whatever, we can imagine those progressing very far with, maybe DNA-based nanorobots wandering around, serving as an auxiliary immune system, and things that then from there edge further and further towards transhuman enhancement, that potentially alleviating a lot of physical suffering. We kind of put to the side psychological suffering as being something that might be of a different kind. Maybe I'll add one little note there, which is obviously we feel pain for a reason, right? And maybe it's unpleasant, but it's part of our mechanisms for high-level guidance of behavior. And our psychological pains, although sometimes just clearly like illness, exist in large part, it seems, to help guide behavior also. And while those guides to behavior might no longer be appropriate because anxiety around large crowds, having evolved in a situation where large crowds were not as common, might not be that useful. Still, it is the case that whatever environment we find ourselves in, heuristics appropriate to that environment baked into kind of emotional response or something on that level does seem to sort of be how our cognition works. So to propose to remove all those layers of heuristics because they're unpleasant seems to me to be an intervention in our basic psychology that is unwarranted and probably unwise. If you just want it to be entirely reason and all we're left with is Spock or something, then I think that is not transhumanism. That is basically changing us into something else. So I think you wouldn't advocate for that either. You would accept some range of suffering as being intrinsic, perhaps, of certain kinds, and seek to alleviate the rest, that being like the vast majority of the problem anyway, and so that's all fine. Would you agree?
Yeah, with a couple of caveats there. Although that's interesting, but I would agree with a couple of caveats. The first is that we know that we have existence proofs of individuals, many individuals, who through training and education, and I'm, to pick your school of meditation, of mindfulness, the proverbial monks and folks who have sought out and cultivated states of mind that allow them to gain much better control over their inherent emotional apparatus than most people do. Most people are just sort of, dragged around by without much conscious effort or control by their emotional experiences. And I'm certainly guilty of that. But my understanding is that there are practices of mental discipline that can allow people to exist in emotional states that really alleviate a lot of this sort of the suffering from anxiety and these other ultimately, socially evolved for social purposes. These emotional mechanisms that have evolved for social purposes, and so I would, as a first choice, if there were options on the table, if I were to choose the option of removing all emotion and all possible suffering and becoming Vulcan Spock-like, as coldly rational and so forth, I think I would not choose that. I think I would choose an intervention that allowed me to become wise and not necessarily detached, but just more sophisticated and more skillful in the way that has demonstratively been the case for individuals and throughout history who've earned various different practices and schools of practice as far as mental discipline and emotional discipline go. So I think there's a lot to be gained there. That's the first thing. The only other caveat that I had, or the only other comment that I would have, is that I think the fact that none of the mental suffering that we have right now is avoidable in the sense that it is entirely non-optional. I think that in itself is a part of the human condition that if we could change it, this would make an enormous difference, very, very large difference. Here's what I mean. Right now, you can't choose to turn your emotions off. You can't choose to not feel things. Or if you do make that choice, the mechanism by which you make that choice is so crude with such devastating consequences that it destroys you in many other ways. So, for example, you can take heroin to not feel, to not suffer psychologically, but the consequences of doing so just are life destroying. But if and this, again, you mentioned the culture earlier, Dan. This is part of the culture. Is individuals in Ian and Banks' culture series, they have the ability to basically turn these parts of their brain on and off at will. And you could turn pain off at will. You could turn anxiety and fear off at will. Other characters and entities throughout science fiction have these abilities, and these things are explored with some interesting storytelling outcomes. But I do think that's the fact that we don't have a choice is well, it's quite frankly, it's pretty abominable. It's absolutely horrific. And this is probably what I'm. It's actually it's really, that's probably where I was coming from subconsciously when I said evolution is merciless. Evolution is ruthless, right? We feel pain and we have no option not to, because evolution is merciless. Why would it give us the option to turn our pain off? But it's life would be very different if you could choose to not experience pain. If you could choose, okay, well, yeah, yes, I'm afraid in this situation, but you know what? I'm just going to dial that down because it's not appropriate to be that afraid. It's not useful to me right now. But I won't just carve it out of my mind permanently and forever to get rid of it. I'll just, give me a volume knob on these negative emotional states or negative cognitive states, and give me a volume control, and then I'll dial that up and down and tune it to the situation or to my own personal choices. And if you had dials like that, if you had volume knobs on all of these things, would you just turn them all to zero and never touch them again? Maybe some people would, but I don't think I would. I think it would take a lot of this. It would take a lot of the spice and the
Sure.
Subtleties out of experience. But the fact that we don't have volume knobs at all, that is really, we're very much slaves and prisoners to our biology because of that. Okay, so that would be an intervention that would be amazing, I think.
I have a thought experiment for you. Let's take the glorious transhumanist future and add a bit of spice to it. So it's 2049. Adam has transitioned into his Chris Hemsworth form, and everything's looking good. There's a small orbital colony of transhumanist gods, and they are planning for their future takeover of the galaxy. But there's a small breakaway sect which decides that this kind of pleasant existence is a bit kind of, milk toast, and decides to put back in a volume knob because they notice that, there are many possibilities for exploring the future configuration of transhumanists that are not being explored aggressively because people are just kind of pretty happy and laid back, and there's like the rest of time they're going to live forever. Why rush it? And those meat bags back on Earth are so far behind, they're not really a problem. So let's just take our time and get it right and enjoy the good life as transhumanist demigods. But this young, slightly antsy transhumanist decides, no, that's not fast enough for me. In order to keep myself on the edge and innovating and pushing forward the configuration of the human mind into new and unexplored territory and reaching new heights of capability, I'm going to just put in a little interrupt, which every time I'm sort of going too long being happy just kind of prods me back onto the course of no, we have to improve faster. And that's not quite on line with the, all mellow, grand meditation philosophy of the rest of the transhumanists. But anyway, he does it and sort of modifies his own behavior in a way he can't change, so that, yes, he's kind of like a bit more aggressive, a bit more impatient about changing himself and evolving, going forwards. And he seems to get somewhere, and other people start to join him, and pretty soon there's a little faction like that have basically reinstantiated some kind of unpleasant emotion that interrupts other behaviors to push them back onto a path that seems like more consistent with some value. The beginning is kind of arbitrary and they made it up themselves, but over time begins to seem like an evolutionary advantage. And those antsy guys, they find some antsy transhuman women and have antsy transhuman babies, and those are the ones that spread out to colonize the solar system. And then we're just back into negative emotion territory, and we're back where we started in some sense. Those who choose to reinstantiate basically something like suffering, but at a higher level. It's not physical pain, but it's kind of unpleasant and diverts them from things they otherwise feel happy to do, to focus on this kind of more hardcore evolutionary optimization target of just spreading out and transforming stuff and advancing. So that takes over, and there was just this brief interregnum of transhumanists that Adam would find like actually a pleasant target for himself, and then it's back to basically the same old bullshit.
I think you go to a great sci-fi short story on your hands. It's a really cool thought experiment. I guess my pushback would be that once you have a choice, then I think you've opened up a new range of possibilities of what's that's subtle. And I don't know. I mean, I guess that if you're sparking off a subsequent evolutionary arms race towards along some dimension, and evolution rewards rewards progress, forward progress on that dimension, then yes, there will be a selection. You can invoke very quickly a selection dynamic, a competitive dynamic that will select for, preserve, and replicate and propagate a set of values or inclinations accordingly. And this is we fear this in artificial systems too, right? That it will just be evolutionary processes that naturally select for systems with values, goals, compulsions, incentives, or other incentive structures that serve to advance along down some path that has some disutility from our perspective. And yeah, it's a concern. I mean, it is genuinely a real concern. One thing, I don't want to elaborate too far on that, but one thing that does call to mind is for human beings who are now intelligent and can take other action other than the action compelled by pain alone. One that has to question, what are the compulsions of pain useful for? Are they still useful? So, and I think Richard Dawkins said this, at some point. I think I saw him give him a speech years ago, and it struck me. He said, we understand pain and its purpose, but why does it have to hurt so damn much? and that's the astute observation. Pain is informative, right? It's information. It's informative. But more than being informative, it's also compelling. It is compulsive. It is a compelling force. It compels the organism experiencing it to behave in certain ways, right? Whether that's taking certain actions or foregoing certain actions. Pain does more than just tell you you're injured or sick or in trouble. Pain is a heuristic that forces you to take a certain action or not take a certain action or set of actions. And once we no longer needed that crude heuristic compulsion to, sit still, lie down until you feel better, or whatever. Once now we've got hospitals we go to when we're injured. We don't just lie down and wait till the bones knit or the infection is fought off. We recognize we're sick and we go get treated. Do we need the compulsion of pain, or do we just need the information?
Have you heard of
it to be informative?
Have you heard of leprosy?
Oh yeah. Well, so yeah, and then one can, then one can evoke exceptions to all of this. Yeah, for sure. You're right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're numb, then you're but this is also interesting too, which is that leprosy has different consequences depending on the society you're in. And it can be manageable in a society that's prosperous enough because you can be mindful not to injure yourself nearly as much, despite your extremities being numb and so forth. And that doesn't say it's a good condition or even a tolerable or manageable condition, but its outcomes are very in their extremis as a function of whether you're a leper on the street crawling on your hands and knees, which destroys you much more quickly than if you a rich aristocrat or something historically. And we've seen that historically. People don't get leprosy really anymore in modern countries, but when they did, the rich managed it a lot better than the poor did, for example. But it is it's a fair point. What happens when you lose sensation? This does bring up another interesting thing, which is that a huge amount of human sensation physically is devoted to injury avoidance, probably more than we appreciate.
So aren't your transhumanist gods just lepers?
Well, if you can be damaged and recover from that damage instantly, then that begs the question: what is it? What's the use of it? If pain is, if you can detect damage, but it doesn't compel you in a certain direction, like you're the Terminator. And Terminator says, "Yeah, well, I can tell when I'm damaged." I think that was a line in one of the Terminator movies. Must have been Terminator 2 when he was a good guy. He's like, yeah, when I get it doesn't hurt, but my system detects injury, and the information could be called pain. Well, no, it doesn't. It's not pain if it doesn't hurt. If you just look down, oh yeah, I'm injured, I better go get that taken care of. That's not pain the way that we normally construe it, right? That's just being informed in some sense about your state. But there's a fine line between that and being numb. And being numb is its own problem. And would you I don't think we would choose to be insensate, to be numb, just for the sake of being pain-free. So we would want all the richness and subtlety of sensory experience, just like Richard Dawkins says. God, let's why does it have to hurt so damn much? Just have it not hurt as much. That would be nice for a start. But anyway, and we're running out of time here. I don't know if we even have time to move on to the robotics thing.
Let's do a little bit. Yeah. I think there's some things we can come back to there, but yes, let's move on to robotics. I guess partly you're referring to there was a recent demo released by Tesla that was pretty impressive with their latest generation of bots that have gone through several evolutions over the last year and a half, where it started with some bozo in a suit on stage dancing.
I got that. They've been very. In hindsight, that was not a good PR decision. It landed wrong for most audiences. But I understood their intention there, and it didn't land wrong with me. It was like, yeah, this is. I get it. This is, we're not there yet, but this is the aspiration. It's, and I thought that was fun. But yes, no, it was taken. That was received badly, and fair point for ridicule for the dancing person in a suit. But yeah, the progress has been remarkable from a number of players. Tesla's one of them, but there are a number of others. Figure AI is a big one, and Aloha. And there've been projects and startups. So in other words, projects at large established tech giants like Google, and startups, entirely new places, showing progress. There have been long-standing players that aren't huge, like Boston Robotics, that are putting out things that look increasingly impressive. So what it feels like is that there is there's some sort of there's a nascent, an imminent sense to me that breakthroughs, leaps in progress into, or at least passing of thresholds into capabilities that are suddenly useful, as opposed to just parlor tricks kind of thing. That feels very close to me now, in a way that it didn't feel close a year ago or 2 years ago. And so you mentioned earlier, Dan, that you would push back against this claim that hardware has been a limitation, or rather, against the claim that hardware has not been the primary limitation for many decades, but rather software has been the primary limitation. But you seem to think that that's not necessarily a given.
Yeah, I guess I understand why you say that, and I think that's consistent with the relatively rapid progress that's been made since we've had progress in deep learning and data at relevant scale to apply it to in robotics. I think that was sort of a breakthrough that, maybe it's been picking up for 5 or 6 years, but definitely, I'm not an insider, but from the outside, feels like it was a breakthrough. But in some sense, I've seen many insiders in robotics talk about just how profoundly limiting the hardware was, even if you wanted to do that. And part of the reason I suspect why Tesla has been able to make such rapid progress is because they have capability in both directions. It's just that, I guess most robotics historically, industrial robots, of course, a different story, but if you're talking about hands and kind of humanoid robots and a lot of that research, I think, I don't know what's happening in Japan. There seems to be something happening there, but maybe it sort of doesn't go very far or something. I'm not an expert. But the academic research, which I guess I've been paying some attention to over the last decade or more, seems to have been pretty heavily limited by just the cost of buying robotic things. Or you build them yourselves, but there's a limit to how much you can do as an academic. So I think maybe it was limited on both fronts, both on the hardware front, just due to the cost, and that implied a limitation on the software front, because you can't get training data without many robots to train on. And even Google, had rooms and rooms full of robot hands at some point, has been trying things like that since, 2015, 2016 or earlier. But there was just a limit to how much training data you could get. And I think, the combination of having large industrial players like Tesla actually be able to iterate quickly on actual hardware, plus simulation, plus deep learning progress, is together what's responsible for the kind of breakthrough progress we seem to be in the middle of. That's my impression, and again, I could be quite wrong about that, but I think it's not only that we were waiting for software. I think the hardware was sort of really quite relatively primitive in some sense also.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. In certainly the hardware, it wasn't like amazing robots were standing around, but just too dumb to do anything. Certainly that wasn't the case. I think my perspective is more that, in a counterfactual history, 75 years ago, if we had dropped, the software capability, the AI capability into the world in 1950, then the hardware would have caught up very quickly, because the hardware wasn't ultimately the limiting factor. It wasn't ultimately the bottleneck there. Software has been the limit. And once software, that limit started to feel like the limitation was being overcome and that was being alleviated as a bottleneck, then this surge of progress in the hardware was sort of inevitable and also easy in some sense, some low-hanging fruit. That's more of my impression here. Again, I'd certainly be wrong. The other thing is that I do suspect, and turn back to science fiction. I'm sure I'm not originating these ideas; these are in science fiction. But a sufficiently intelligent mind could effect control over the real world, over reality, over the physical world, with fairly primitive hardware to work with. So, I mean, if you were a human, like in the same way that Aloha, I think it was Aloha, Google's team, just demonstrated that, when operated by a sophisticated model or by a human teleoperator, you can do a lot with just two pinching claws, just two pinchers. You can fold laundry and you can wash dishes. I mean, a human's got a pretty darn good neural net, right? But with that kind of sophistication, the hardware can be pretty rubbishy, and you can still get amazing things done. And so in that sense, also, hardware hasn't been the limiting factor. Hardware could be pretty crappy, and if you were smart enough, you could still do really valuable things with that. And so that's in both of, I'm thinking hardware as being not the limiting factor in both of those senses, and that the breakthroughs we've been waiting for have been software and AI breakthroughs. And now that we're finally getting those, the breakthroughs in hardware are coming fast and furious. And I guess ultimately my claim would be, this should surprise nobody. This shouldn't become as a surprise. We should have been expecting this to happen. That once we had truly remarkable leaps forward or steps forward, but just far enough up the curve in AI and software, that the hardware that progress would just come on very quickly and start making its own leaps forward. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I don't know if that's the case or not. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with what I'm saying. I mean, so the fact state of hardware wasn't like it had saturated progress or something. It was just waiting for a reason to invest real money in it. When we're talking about humanoid robots and hands and so on, to drive down the cost. And that, as long as there was no fundamental progress in the software, there was no reason to expect such an investment would pay off. But we've crossed some threshold now with enough people demonstrating enough capability that it very clearly makes sense to pour lots and lots of money into better hardware, because you'll expect that it will result in applications, maybe not, in a couple of years, but, I was watching the Tesla bot fold laundry or whatever. It doesn't seem that far away.
Well, my question was, I have to confess that being very impressed by that, especially the hands. I mean, it is teleoperated. That's not being driven by software. That's there's a teleoperator standing off to the side there, and some of their other demonstrations of the bot were driven by AI, and the hand movements were already very fluid and organic, in the sense that they look like biological movements because they have the same sort of economy and synchrony of motion. So there's already been progress there. That's not to undermine Tesla's progress in that front. But the laundry folding example specifically, it was very quickly clarified. I think Elon Musk clarified it himself, although I don't know, he's he's pretty misleading a lot of the time. But my understanding is that it was Tesla, one way or the other, clarified very quickly. No, this is a teleoperator. We're showcasing the physical dexterity of these humanoid hands. We're not saying this bot is software and AI capable of folding laundry by itself yet. So then my immediate question is, wow, that's pretty impressive physical dexterity, and a presumptive course for players like Tesla and others who are competing in that is to hire an army of low-cost workers to step into these teleoperator suits or whatever they are, start capturing millions of hours of laundry folding basically, and then training the AI, whatever these models are from there, and racing up the ramp to being capable, and basically following the same pattern that has been successful in other domains, and in the case of Tesla specifically and Google specifically, success in self-driving vehicles. It doesn't even need to be any transfer between the training sets. Just the approach seems to me like it could prove quite successful. And then here's one more thought to put on the table with all of this. Is I'm wondering about timelines, but especially timelines to capabilities that aren't as mission critical or safety critical or whatever as driving is. because vehicles have to be, they're so dangerous and so much can go wrong that they have to be very close to flawless in order to deploy. But who gives a crap if a laundry folding robot isn't perfect yet? I mean, a bot that can fold laundry 80% capably is still very, very valuable, even if it's not 90 or 100 or 99 or 99.999% human capability. It's still amazing. I would buy a laundry folding robot very quickly.
Really?
So
yeah. Maybe. Yeah, but I think to take a leaf out of your disruption playbook, I think it's also the case that it's much easier to possibly arrange the domains in which such robots might be deployed to take advantage of whatever level of capability they actually have. Whereas
absolutely true. Yes,
rearranging the driven infrastructure is, on the other hand, much more difficult and expensive. So I guess I think the self-driving cars have hit a bit of a problem. I was speaking over the last 2 weeks ago. I was at a conference speaking to some people who not directly work on it, but work on some of the kind of deep learning sort of the problems that are coming up there and know a lot about it directly. And yeah, there's just a lot of difficulty with the current generation of at least image recognition neural networks transferring to new environments, right? Like where you change the weather or you change some thing that we would not be bothered by, but there isn't as much transfer from learning in different domains to other domains as you might expect with the current techniques. And that means that it's quite difficult to get to very high reliability just because of the long tail and edge cases. I do think...
you have, Dan... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to ask if you... Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead. You go ahead, please.
Okay. I have discussed with them, and I think most people agree that things like GPT-4 vision, like the multimodal models, incorporate more common sense and probably will push... they're very expensive, of course, to deploy something like that, much more expensive in terms of... the models in cars have to both be using pretty cheap hardware and run very fast. And at low latency, and those are difficult conditions under which to run a language model currently. We'll get there very soon, and of course people are quite incentivized to do that. So I don't think it's a fundamental obstacle. I think incorporating those into self-driving seems like it will push us up to another plateau. I don't know how high that plateau is, like how many nines of reliability that becomes. It does seem like it probably gets us a significant distance from where we are now, would be my guess. And obviously that's how the robots are being currently developed. But I think there might be, there could be some kind of plateau there where for some time we have robots, if the Optimus thing lives up to what it's currently doing and sort of the obvious extrapolations we might imagine, you could see a consumer product like that being developed, which has some of the similar problems to the current generations of chatbots, right? Which is that it's sort of pretty awesome in some limited time span, but if you ask it to do complex long-term tasks that rely on low error across many, many different operations, then you might be disappointed. I'm astonished by GPT-4 being able to, I give it some instructions to make some plots of some complicated mathematical phenomena, and it goes off and invents the code and runs the code and gives me the plot. It's amazing, but you can only chain so many steps like that together before it basically becomes pretty unreliable. And if you have a robot like that, then, you could sort of imagine pretty quickly getting frustrated with it the way you're frustrated with Siri right now. But you could redesign the tasks and the environments. Homes, the arrangement of homes and the devices in them changes pretty radically every generation, right? Like, who's to stop you from rearranging your home so that you can take advantage of this nearly there robot to alleviate a lot of your household chores? And certainly I think we would both do that.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. The compounding step the compounding at each step of error does seem to be a fundamental problem. I certainly experienced that with ChatGPT specifically. And one thing I've noticed is that or at least one thing that I've intuited, probably incorrectly, you guys correct me, is that ChatGPT seems to lose the plot. Like it doesn't have a clear goal in mind that it can error correct towards, in the same way that a human being, even an unskilled human being, might be able to error correct towards. So like a human being it isn't 100% or even close to 100% error free in most environments or activities. You just walk through your house. You're just walking is not, you misstep all the time and you have to error correct. But if you know where you're headed, that error correction is manageable, or not trivial, but manageable, right? So you error correct to keep on track towards your goal, despite continuously falling off track. And I mean, that kind of literally, with the walking example, literally off track and back on track, but then metaphorically as well. Pick a task. If something doesn't work, you just error correct until it works, and you try and you try and try until it works. And that seems to be a big part of what human endeavor, small and large, is. But you can't error correct towards a goal without having a very clear idea of what that goal is. And then you need values, and you need, any error correction, so forth and so on. And I'm sure that, I'm not saying anything novel or interesting here at all. This has got to be a major part of what research is pursuing right now, is how to specify goals, or have goals be useful, even if they aren't specified. They can be general enough, and then to admit of or to permit error correction along the way, and how fast do you iterate on that, and how often do you stop and check, hey, am I making good progress, or have I deviated off course here? And human beings, I mean, you're checking your progress towards your goals, small and large, just constantly. That feedback loop is just spinning breakneck with every person, every moment, every waking moment. You're constantly doing that. And so yeah, and I'm sure that's a major part of the challenge with driving, is you have to if you're moving 70 miles an hour with a 3-ton vehicle, you got to be damn sure you're not deviating for more than a tiny fraction of a second from where you should be, or your trouble rises very quickly. With so that's definitely, I mean, I can definitely see something like that being the case, where with some robust error correction, you could have a robot that's pretty sloppy with folding laundry. But if it takes it 2 hours to fold laundry, okay, I mean, just sit down there and just work on it until you're done. And I still think that would be very useful. The laundry folding robot is just one colloquial application that's kind of fun to ponder, because in our own personal lives, this is a pretty widely shared pain point. But there's a lot of many hundreds of other applications that that I think represent relatively low hanging fruit there, where again, that aren't safety constrained or otherwise represent huge high stakes, high risk sort of stuff. Sorry, I wanted to ask a question. You mentioned transfer learning, and do you have a sense, or is there a sense in the literature at all, any promising leads on how human transfer learning is able to be successful? I mean, is it that we've got this amazing language model or other world model, physics model running in the background that is sort of that all of these other sub models are able to reach out a hand for help, or to I mean, how are we able to transfer learning so well, compared to much more brittle and much more fragile AI models right now? Is there anywhere? I guess I'm wondering, are there any promising leads on that front, or is it still kind of fundamentally just how the hell do we do this? It's mysterious.
No, I think it's still a mystery. I mean, people refer to this as sample complexity, right? Like, how much can you learn from each demonstration, from each sample? And still fundamentally, the sample complexity of our neural networks seems to be very low compared to humans. Depends how you measure, of course, and how much information you think is in the genome, etc. But I think it's pretty clear that, not that much direct information seems to be in the genome beyond learning algorithms and some heuristics or something. It's obviously hard to know.
Sure.
But
but there must be some correlation. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just introspecting here, so maybe this is useless. But just simply introspecting, like you said, I don't know if I caught the term exactly, but you said the sample complexity. Is that what you said? How much you're able to basically learn from each individual sample or experience? But in human beings, like when I introspect on that, that's hugely dependent. I shouldn't be hyperbolic. There seems to be some correlation there with what I already know. Like I can pick up something in just a few steps if it bears some resemblance or something. It's not totally alien and totally new. If I can just draw upon some domains of skill or knowledge that I've already got, there must be a correlation between what you already know and you've already learned and some quote unquote new domain where you're trying to learn with a small number of experiences or samples. That's got to be that, at least. Anyway, I don't know. What do I know? But that feels to me, when I introspect, that's the case. Like I can learn something that's kind of adjacent to something I already know much more readily from a few examples than some totally radically alien thing that I've never experienced before at all. That's just, again, for what it's worth, which is not much. It's just an intuition there.
I think that's partly why people often struggle to learn things like mathematics, especially more abstract things, because most people learn by kind of trying to shoehorn a bunch of heuristics and metaphors with other things, and if they can't make that work, they get quite frustrated and unhappy generally, which is why it often people feel quite like aggrieved when you explicitly point out to them that they're trying to do that and that this is a mistake and they can't do that and they should give up and adopt a more first principled approach, which is not how people generally want to approach problems. And then they're very, very slow, relatively. So, yeah, I think that's correct. I think there's been one kind of genuine deep insight on this front, which is the difference between the kind of outer loop of optimization in, say, transformers, where you're just wiggling the weights in order to improve performance on an X token prediction task. And so let's just call that learning, or so the outer loop. The inner loop, or in-context learning, is what happens when you take something like GPT-4, which is of course not changing its weights while you're interacting with it. But nonetheless, if you provide it many examples of the kind of thing you want, then after providing those examples, it will be better at doing the task that you want it to do. So that's called in-context learning. And that's a profound phenomena. I would say the discovery that this happens is not only like just one-off on like GPT models, but seems to be quite a universal phenomena tied to some deep principle of learning or something. We're actually investigating this as a sort of academically. I think it's a very deep observation that this kind of layered learning exists, and the sample complexity of the in-context learning, although hard to define, is arguably much higher. So I think that if I had to make a prediction of the key capability that might emerge in the next generation or the generation after of GPT models, or just large models in general, it would be that maybe this inner optimization becomes profoundly better, or there's even further inner levels or something like that, where I would speculate that the human learning algorithm is sort of multi-layered in some way that's not currently, like it's too naive to think that just wiggling weights by gradient descent is sufficient. So I think we're probably like whatever is in our genome is probably like a learning algorithm that is very, very, very highly tuned to instantiating other learning algorithms, and those themselves instantiate other learning algorithms in such a way that the result is highly sample efficient. And we are like, the genome is maybe if you just run large learning machines, like you just have a big enough neural net, this happens automatically. And we're sort of seeing that in our transformers, and we're doing it in a very brute force way. If I had to guess, I would say that the genome is basically bypassing a lot of that brute force by like just it did a lot of search over evolutionary time and found like a way of like sticking in very few bits in the genome, a way of like getting to that algorithm, which is just like search and search and search and search, and makes that happen in our brains in a way that we will get to with sufficient scale. And then maybe once we've done that, we can see how to do it more efficiently. And then, it'll be easy to do in like 3 billion parameter models or something, but we'll only understand it once we've gotten there by brute force. That's my default timeline for how this goes.
Interesting. I've got to go, you guys. I have a hard stop here on the hour. One super quick thought, only it just occurred to me, but never seen it anywhere, which is you mentioned some learning algorithm that's sort of encoded in DNA and then manifests itself, Trotsky's doll style, just keeps unfolding and unfolding and unfolding as it instantiates itself in the systems that it builds, which then are inclined to have subsequent algorithm instantiate itself. Okay, here's my thought. I don't know if this is meaningful at all, but I think we have an inherent bias from human experience that human babies come out completely tabula rasa, uncooked, nothing, and especially the idea that the brain is just totally untrained, and you have to learn everything. That basically when the neural nets start training the moment you're born, the day you're born. But we know that this isn't the case because when horses can walk 2 minutes after they're born and that kind of thing. So here's the observation is I wonder how much training of biological neural nets actually happens in utero, in the egg or in the womb, from the very, very beginning. Like as soon as those neurons emerge, as soon as the cells differentiate and nervous systems start to form, they're training. And then the question is, what are they training on? What's the data? Like, what is the data that they're training on? Maybe it is sensory data, or maybe it's something more than that. Maybe at first it's something closer to quorum sensing that we have in single cell organisms, but probably it's sensory data pretty quickly too. I don't know if there's anything about this, but it would be interesting to know what is the early training like when an organism is, goes from just a blastocyst to a few hundred to a few thousand to a few, cells. And then, what is the data that's being trained on? This is a fun thought. I don't know. I haven't seen anything about that.
There's a bit about that in developmental neuroscience, but we can talk about it next time. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Cool. That was fun.
Awesome. And, thank you, guys. All right.
See you next
time.
Take
care.
Jay.
Thanks for accommodating. Bye.
Yeah, no problem. See you guys.